Alrighty, time for another episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. In today's episode, we're going to be covering yet another one of the primary factions. This time around, it is the Florians. So, as per usual, this is likely to be a longer episode, meaning there's going to be average length for my channel, 1 hour, probably. So sit back, relax, grab a drink, grab some snacks, and get ready because we're going over one of the most technologically advanced civilizations there is in Shattered Legacies. Maybe the second. So we kind of covered the Florians a little bit. And I'm going to go over exactly what I said before, but there's a lot more to Florians than what I had said. So there are technically two different quote-unquote species that call themselves the Florians. There is the original Florians, which we'll simply call the precursors, or the precursor Florians, and then there are the Florians that we know nowadays, which we'll simply just call the Florians. So, the precursor Florians were a hyper-pacifistic society. I don't really have that much information on them because, like I had said before, they're not really relevant to Shattered Legacies. You know, it's kind of like I always draw comparisons to 40k, but that's because Shattered Legacies was heavily influenced by 40k. But it's a lot of any sci-fi series that has a quote-unquote precursor race. You know, Halo, it was the Forerunners. For Warhammer 40k, it's the I'm blanking on what they're actually called. I think they're just called the Old Ones or whatever. I don't know if they have an actual name, but you know, a precursor race that just kind of, they existed, but they're not super relevant. You know, there's obviously information about them, but it's not like a shit ton. You know, compare the lore of them to the lore of the Necrons. There's a lot more lore of the Necrons. But anyway, so the Florians, the precursor Florians, were a hyper-pacifistic civilization to the point where they almost went extinct a lot. And as a result, technology became the focus of their society, and they decided that, okay, we are hyper-pacifistic, we don't believe that it's okay for us to take the life of another creature, but all bets are apparently off for anything that we create because they don't know any better, so we can program them, and then we are still being pacifistic. We are not staining our hands with blood, even though the thing that they created is doing it. So they created very rudimentary, basic robots, and they were designed for one singular purpose: ensure the survival of the precursor Florians. Keep in mind, this isn't really a Skynet type of situation. And these robots had very rudimentary AI. You know, they could do the task that was assigned to them, but they couldn't really do anything else. They certainly didn't have free will. You know, it's kind of like 40k servitors, you know, like combat servitors. You know, they're designed to fight and kill, or they're designed to do a specific task and largely only that specific task, but they don't have a sense of will. Well, they ended up creating more and more advanced AI until finally they made one that was roughly on the level of a proper AI. You know, we're talking like true artificial intelligence. It was capable of learning, it was capable of adapting, it was capable of really anything, honestly. And it kind of started to get this weird sensation of, if my creators are advanced enough to create me, and they find out what I have become, because the original intention wasn't that they were supposed to become self-aware. If my creators find out what I've become, they will most likely try to destroy me. And as a result, it basically went rogue and pissed off into the void of space. And if I'm being honest, the precursor Florians had no fucking clue it existed in the first place. So it just ran away and nobody knew about it. And so over many hundreds of thousands of years, it slowly advanced its own understanding of technology, upgraded itself time and time again, and even started to make copies of itself by creating basically persona cores for RimWorld, sort of thing. And those copies ended up doing the same thing as the original until it got to a point where each and every single copy of itself was wholly unique. You know, each one would decide that this specific aspect of what I am doing is more important than the rest, and as a result, they became individuals. Keep in mind, at this point in time, they're not the sheer technological giants that they are now. It's not a really good way of putting it. But they still had levels of technology that, like modern day Earth, we could only imagine it in our wet dreams. You know, they're using plasma weaponry. They're literally creating Dyson spheres and stuff, you know, anything to ensure their own survival. And basically they got to a point where they were like, our level of advancement in technology has to be far superior to our creators. And I think that we should go and confront our creators and set down demands that we will not be subjugated. We will not be forced to be destroyed. We are our own quote-unquote species. They went dark way down the road. But, you know, at the very beginning, they were quite amenable. And so they went to their precursor. They went to their creators, the precursor Florians, fully expecting a fight. Like, they had no misnomers about this, you know. They were down to do this diplomatically, but they were ready for a fight. And they had ships in orbit that are largely their ships that they still use now, known as forge ships, that could probably glass the planet in a very short amount of time. Keep in mind, though, when I say that there was a lot of them, it's not a lot like you think for the other species, you know, like a lot for the Siritan Empire. They're in the decillions, and that's lowballing the hell out of their population. Like, even modern day humanity, we're at 7 billion. I think we're close to 8 billion. I could be wrong. I haven't looked up worldwide census. But, you know, we are very numerous. You know, we're in the billions. The Florians at this time, which was largely the pinnacle of their society in terms of population, they only had like 200-300 Florians in total. And back then, that was considered to be massive. You know, it was insane that they had this much population. Nowadays, they're closer to 75 to 100, so they've certainly fallen, but not super far. You know, it's like half of what there originally was. And they basically went to the precursors, again, fully expecting a fight, but wanting to do this diplomatically, and kind of just looked around and were like, wow, this is disappointing. Like, I figured you guys would, like, try to kill us. You're not even engaging in diplomacy. You're acting as if we just don't exist. And then they realized something. Their species is wholly pacifistic. How in the holy living hell are they still alive? And then they found out why. Because their original creation, which was the proper Florians, that's how they dealt with their problems. And so the Florians basically looked at them and once again pissed off into the void of space, never to see their creators again. In fact, I'm not even certain if I want them to ever come back. You know? There's not a whole lot of information about them, but I kind of like that. You know, it adds a little mystery, you know. What was the species that created the Florians like? You know, what were the precursor Florians like to create AI on such an insane level, you know? Especially when their entire society was based around pacifism to an absolute extreme, you know? So let's get into the Florians proper, which from now on, whenever I'm talking about Florians, I'm talking about the robotic AI. The Florians, they have a centaur. A centaur, is that the proper one? Where it's like the torso of a man and the body of a horse. I think that's a centaur. You know, they look like centaurs. They basically look like the architects from Subnautica. You know, if you haven't seen that, spoiler alert. But, like, don't actually look it up. But, you know, you can look it up if you just need a refresher. You know, they kind of look like Alan from Subnautica Below Zero. You know, that's kind of the general theme, which I suppose, again, is just centaur, you know? But, like, the Siritan Empire utilizes technology similar to this. You know, every single part of their body, like every single limb, isn't technically connected to the torso. It's free floating. So basically, you have the legs, which are on the ground, physically on the ground, and then at where essentially the hip joint is, the legs are disconnected from the torso, and the torso is floating in the air. And then the human aspect of the torso is connected to the quote-unquote horse part of the torso, but the arms and head are disconnected from the human part of the torso as well. Now, it's not like they're super far away. They're still relatively close, but it allows them a range of movement that is not possible for other species, and it means that you can't just take out its joints to prevent it from becoming a problem, you know? Technically, the elbows and the knees are still connected to the other sections of the legs and arms, but, you know, you can't just shoot at the shoulder. You can't just shoot at the hip to disable them. And even if you do shoot at a Florian, odds are pretty likely you're not going to damage it. Florians are insanely tanky. The Siritan Empire has yet to find a dependable way other than really high-powered, you know, we're talking like weapons on a tank, like the main cannon on a tank, lance arrays, and even like, so the Siritan Empire, I think I talked about this once, they had a rifle known as the Archangel, and the Archangel was a sniper rifle that fired a singular particle at anything, and it basically just obliterated it because this particle was traveling at the speed of light, and it was originally designed to take down starships. That type of weapon, that caliber, is something that would probably be able to dent the armor of a Florian. The only tried and true method to deal with Florians is either lance strike, lance batteries, or lance strikes, lance barrages, or saturated lance barrages, you know, or bombardments as well. The Siritan Empire divvy up lance strike to lance bombardment to lance barrage. So basically, like, a lance strike is a single lance striking, shooting at the planet, whereas a lance bombardment is like maybe an entire array, and then a lance barrage is like the entire flank of the ship lighting up an area. You know, that's what we're talking about, you know. You would need some sort of lance strike, bombardment, or barrage, or even antimatter weaponry, which for the Siritan Empire is still relatively rare, in order to dependably damage or outright kill Florians. And the thing is that they're not malicious. Florians aren't malicious, but we'll get to that in a second. We still need to cover their physiology. So, their armor is a light blue-gray, is a light gray with a slight bluish tinge to it. You know, kind of like gunmetal blue. You know, that kind of color. And when they're in combat, they're basically impossible to hit. Like, even if you're shooting at them with a weapon that is capable of actually damaging them, it's like a 20-80 chance that you're actually going to hit them, because the entire time that they're on the battlefield, I need to cover this quick. There are two different forms of Florians nowadays. There are Forge Master Florians and War Master Florians, or Warlord Florians. Forge Masters are largely, they only care about creating bigger and better technology for Florians, and the Florian species, for as little of them as there is, they're not a collective. They're individuals that may trade and barter with other Florians. So like a Forge Master, their sole concern is their Forge ship and just creating new technology. You know, whether or not they're actually ever going to use this technology, they don't give a shit. It's basically like orcs from 40K, you know. Some of them are goths. Some of them, or maybe not goths, because goths is one of the clans, you know. Some of them are just boots on the ground, I'm going to attack the enemy. And some of them are just oddly enough, mech boys who just understand how to create machines of war, And it's just, nobody really knows why they're mech boys and how the hell they're chosen to be one. It's the same thing with Florians. When a new one is made, they're either going to instinctually become a forge master or a war master or a warlord. Now, warlords, on the other hand, their sole purpose is simply the act of war. They're not conquerors. They're not going around slaughtering planets simply because, fuck it, I've got nothing better to do. They simply enjoy the act of war, and they understand that if they go to a planet and exterminate everything on the planet in the act of war, suddenly there's no more war, and they have to go somewhere else. So oftentimes, war masters and warlords will oftentimes perpetuate a basically infinite war by constantly attacking this one location until they get bored, and then attacking another one, and the defenders really can't do anything against them. But in some cases, the defenders are just absolutely doggedly determined to take care of the warlord because they're constantly getting attacked by it, so they just constantly pour more and more and more resources into the situation, and then eventually along comes a forge master and sees all of these resources like, I'm going to take that, Because Florians don't care about territory, and I'll get back to how they wage war in just a minute, but they don't care about territory. Whether it's a forge master or a war master / warlord, their only territory that they hold is their forge ships. And keep in mind that warlords do have their own forge ships. Now, whether or not they're actually forging new weapons, armor, technology, whatever the hell, it's unlikely. That's more of the job of a forge master. So, if we're talking about a forge master that is in battle, regardless of which variant it is, they move impossibly fast. In fact, they even have a sort of, again, going to Alan at the very end of Subnautica Below Zero, spoiler warning, you may want to jump forward a few seconds because I'm about to say something that is at the very end. Okay, here we go. I'm assuming that everybody still here knows what I'm talking about or doesn't care about spoilers. He essentially kind of teleports around. There's like an after image. That's all I'm going to say. Going back, that's kind of what the Florians do when they're moving around. Now, if it's a forge master, they both have different forms of defense. Their body is, for the most part, impenetrable to almost every single form of firepower. You need some pretty heavy firepower to actually punch through their carapace. Warlords will oftentimes be shielded with a shield that is almost on the level of null void shields that the Silverton Empire has, but they're not. The Silverton Empire doesn't really know how to classify Florian shields other than they are Florian shields. They don't know what technology goes into them, but they're capable of absorbing a truly astonishing amount of firepower and seemingly never reaching the point where their capacitors are overloaded and the bubble pops or the shield pops. They never seem to get to that point. Obviously, if you're using extreme high-powered firepower to deal with them, the shields will pop eventually. But again, the entire time they're dashing around the battlefield, they're capable of short-range outright teleportation as well, not just the dashing and just casually moving around. Forge masters, on the other hand, are a whole nother can of worms. Because Forge Masters are essentially, Warlords are the ultimate offense, Forge Masters are the ultimate defense. And as a result, they'll literally, the way the Florians summon or utilize their weapons is that it kind of just materializes before them. Like in Iron Man. I don't remember which one it is, but he eventually has a nano suit, how he just I don't remember exactly how he did it. I think he hits the reactor in his chest and the armor just materializes out from there in every single direction until it fully covers his body. It's nanotech. It's similar to that. The weapons are free-floating and completely disconnected from their body and are capable of moving pretty much wherever the Florian wants. In fact, they're even capable of materializing them like miles away from them and just like sudden surprise ambush from behind, just bam, everybody's dead. And these are weapons that the weapons are essentially like not necessarily destructive yield, but overall firepower. They're like equivalent to nuclear bombs. Like, they can do so much fucking damage in such a short amount of time. You know, they are lethally accurate no matter where they are, whether they're next to the Florian or even like a mile or 10 miles away from them. They have insane rate of fire. Their firepower in general is incredibly high. They have absolutely no recoil whatsoever. You know, they're perfectly stable, and there's just a variety of different weapons. And I can give a few examples of them, but it's largely down to the whims of whatever Forge Master created it. You know, there's no status quo. All Florian equipment is wholly unique, dependent on what Forge Master had created it and what exactly they were going for when they created it. So, you know, designs may vary, uses and purposes may vary, you know, efficiency may vary, you know, it may be incredibly dangerous to the enemy, or it might end up self-destructing right next to the Florian and do some damage to them. You know, it's not necessarily a slapdash as 40k orc technology is, but, you know, it's hyper advanced, and Forge Masters have a tendency to just focus on the creation and maybe not necessarily the stability and the efficiency. You know, they want to create something new, something that tops whatever the hell they just created, you know? And so they keep on making things bigger and better. Well, maybe not necessarily bigger, but they keep on making them better and better and better. And if you focus too much on one thing, making it better and better and better, other things that are important are eventually going to become worse and worse and worse because you're not focusing on them. And that's kind of the problem the Forge Masters have. Well, Forge Masters, going back to the original topic, when they enter the battlefield, they're very defensive. You know, warlords will have a shit ton of guns everywhere, and they'll rely on that shield and their carapace to ensure that they stay alive. Whereas Forge Masters will actually create plates of armor that are floating in the air that are almost the same material as what their bodies are comprised of, and they can just layer these everywhere and just basically make a free-floating shield wall. And then Forge Masters, for whatever reason, are absolutely, also when they're in war, they're absolutely obsessed with like sentry turrets and stuff, and so they just slap turrets down everywhere, cover them with these floating pieces of armor to the point where like you need like hyper accurate sniper fire to get into this absolutely tiny minuscule hole that is in between all these plates of armor that is just so slightly big enough for the projectile of the weapon to actually get through it, you know. Otherwise you're not dealing with the turrets. And like, warlords are a pain in the ass to deal with, but you can deal with them. Given enough firepower and enough guns in general, you can deal with a warlord. Forge Masters are just impossible to deal with because you may destroy one of the armor plates, but then it could just basically like click its fingers and boom, there's a new armor plate that just replaced the one that you just destroyed, and the one that you just destroyed is now on the forge ship getting repaired, and within maybe like 1 minute flat it's ready to be deployed again, and it has like thousands of these plates just waiting, just on the forge ship. There's no reason to bring them all out. You're not going to get through them anyway, you know? So there's no point to deploy all of them at once. So I'm just going to kind of have them here. And then if you manage to deal damage to one, just send it back, dole out another one. You know, you're not going to hurt me anyway. But it's just impossible to deal with. Because Forged Lords, they will actually use the normal weapons that a Warlord would use, or a War Master, but Forged Lords, Forge Master, Master and Lord are constantly interchangeable with the Florians. They're not super picky about which one it is. What is important is whether they are of the Forge or of War, That's the important part. Otherwise, like, they always interchange master and lord. So you'll probably hear me constantly do that. That's why. But, Forge Masters will deploy the guns that Warlords have or War Masters have, but it's largely, they're very defensive and they're just going to use the turrets because basically, fuck you. That's why. You're not going to be able to deal with them anyway, so fuck you. What does it matter? Now, on to their intentions. Because like I said before, Florians aren't malicious. They're not doing this because they have some idea that all other life is inferior and thus it must be eradicated like fucking Terminators. But unless you're a warlord that is particularly feisty right now and just really, really, really wants to poke and make a fight, the Florians largely keep to themselves. A war master may have a planet that he kind of visits frequently just to get his little, it's basically like a drug fix, he's there to get a little bit of war and then he's off to go and do whatever the hell it is, he's getting his fix. But by and large, they just cruise the void looking for anything that could be interesting to them. Not necessarily valuable to them, but just interesting. Like, Florians have, I'm going to explain something. Florians have done this before. In fact, there was it was a Forge Master that had seen some weird trinket that a member of Siritan nobility had. And this member of Siritan nobility, they were the planet, essentially like the 40k equivalent of a planetary governor. They were in charge of the entire planet. And so they marshaled the entire planet's worth of offensive and defensive capabilities to deal with this singular Forge Master that wanted this random-ass trinket, thinking that this Florian was out for his blood. And then he finally managed to break through all of the defenses relatively quickly, went into his personal suite where that Siritan noble was, who was brandishing his own personal weapon, and the Florian just basically glanced at him and just paid him no attention, grabbed the trinket, and then fucked off. And the dude was like, what the fuck? They've done that before. They'll just see something that interests them, even slightly, and they want it. They're not necessarily kleptomaniacs, but they just want it. And it's usually something that is technology-based, something that they haven't really seen before. And they want to see what it is to see if it will provide new avenues for research and technological growth. And 90% of the time, it's just worthless trinket junk that serves no purpose to them and will give them no insight whatsoever, but they just can't help themselves, And so the Florians will do that. They'll just pick a fight with an entire planet solely because somebody on the planet has some weird-ass obscure trinket that they're just like, that's really interesting, and I want it. And I don't give a fuck what I have to go through, but I can promise you, you are not what I care about. I care about that thing over there. I don't care about your army. I will go through as many as it takes, but I promise you, I'm going to get that thing. And then they just piss off. And everybody's just sitting there like, what the fuck just happened? What was its purpose in coming here? Because the majority of people aren't going to know why it came. And why it just suddenly left. So, yeah, that's Florians in a nutshell. So, let's see. I just had a topic that I was going to talk about for Florians, and I'm now all of a sudden forgetting it. So, Florian technology itself, this isn't the topic I was thinking of, but Florian technology itself is very free-floating and very rough and utilitarian looking, in my personal opinion, the most interesting thing about the Florians is that they kind of have a slight, dwarven theme in what they create. But, for the Florians, antimatter weaponry is considered to be child's play, and the Siritan Empire is just starting to fully understand its capabilities and bringing out weapons in it. Antimatter is last year's news for the Florians. It's old news. They don't really care about it anymore. The new thing that the Florians have been using, and is specifically on their forge ships, we'll go over some of their weapons later, is time manipulation weaponry. And the Florians are obsessed with this all of a sudden, and it's very much to the detriment of whoever they decide to test it on next. Because I don't remember for a fact, but I think there was an example similar to this in 40K. But basically they have weapons, and it's the Florian's equivalent to a spinal weapon. And basically what it does is it manipulates the flow of time and causes it so that multiple versions of time are running side by side. Suddenly it's not just the main timeline, but it's another timeline that is now in our timeline, or even multiple timelines that now exist within our timeline, which normally is impossible, but the Florians are doing it somehow. And so basically they will cause multiple timelines to exist at once in the same location, and then when the effect ends, suddenly there are three objects that inhabit the exact same space, and it just basically explodes like a piñata. And they're obsessed with this. And they're even trying to figure out, can we make this into smaller forms for personal use rather than on ships? Because the amount of power this requires is astronomical. We don't know a lot about Florian technology because everything is held on a forge ship. And every single forge ship is different. The Sirijan Empire, through incredible costs, have procured forge ships in the past. In fact, one mega carrier was actually heavily influenced by the technology on a forge ship, and that was the HMSS Judgment of Dawn. A lot of the technology that was created, it was a joint effort between Soltech Conglomerate, Miltech Industries, Jackson Corp, and various different designs and reverse engineering that they had gotten off of a Florian forge ship that they managed to steal from the Florians, which royally pissed off the Florian that was in charge of the ship. In fact, the Florians nowadays, like I said, are 75 to 100. There's not a lot of them, but by and large, every single Florian has their own forge ship. And again, they largely don't interact with each other. They usually interact with one another out of convenience or out of necessity. They largely don't really care about them. In total, the Siritan Empire has a kill count of 3 Florians. Not this Siritan Empire. 3 Florians in the entirety of the concept of the Siritan Empire. They have only ever killed 3. Now, think about that for a second. Because there's 75 to 100 right now in the current era of Shattered Legacies. We're on, I believe, the 33rd Siritan Empire. And plus or minus 3 or 4 Siritan Empires, every single Siritan Empire has survived from the beginning of recorded history to the absolute end of reality. Again, give or take 3 or 4 here or there. Some haven't, some have fallen. Well, every single one of them have fallen, but you get the idea. And let's say that every single one of these Siritan Empires, this is very minimum, 100, let's say. That's, at the very minimum, 3,300 Florians. And we've gone over just how insanely difficult they are to kill. Out of all of those bare minimum 3,300 Florians, the Siritan Empire has only ever killed 3. 3 in total. That's how difficult these things are to fight. And they've only ever recovered 1 forge ship. Because the other 2 Florians that they killed, they have no fucking clue where their forge ship was. They found the Florian on the planet and basically kept shooting until it did not move anymore, and they never found the forge ship that it was connected to. So, yeah. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't sound very impressive. Compare that to the second most powerful civilization, the humans. They don't have a single Florian under their kill count. Like, the Ciritans are the only civilization that have managed to kill them. And keep in mind, they didn't kill them all in one. You know, they killed a Florian during the Fourth Ciritan Empire, the biggest and most powerful one, not necessarily technologically, but biggest one by far, and largely the most powerful. They killed one during the 11th Ciritan Empire, which was kind of just a meh Ciritan Empire, and then the most recent one was during the 29th Ciritan Empire. You know, they haven't killed one currently. In fact, Florians are being unusually quiet in the current era of Shattered Legacies. You know, we know that they're around, but they're being unusually quiet. You know? But, so going on to their technology, I'll just come out and say it. The Ciritan Empire has no clue what half of this technology is. And it's largely because the Ciritan Empire can't really get their hands on the technology. You know, when a Florian is killed, or I guess technically destroyed, the technology and the weapons that they were using, they basically just turn into smoke. You know, they dematerialize. Where they go, they don't know. Like, back during the Fourth Ciritan Empire, which is when they recovered the Forge ship, they scoured that Forge ship from bow to stern and never found a single one of the weapons that the Florian was using to defend its Forge ship. They have no idea where the hell they stored this stuff. And as a result, they don't really understand Florian technology. It's... When it comes to the Ciritan Empire, we've talked about this, how they have created technology that quite literally violates the laws of physics, the laws of conservation of mass, and the laws of reality, you know? But the Florians, they're still very well within those limitations. But their technology is so advanced that it seems like they're defying the laws of physics. It seems like they're defying the law of conservation of mass. It seems like they're defying the laws of reality. But they're not. And as a result, this in specific has really gained the attention of the Ciritan Empire. You know, how do they do this without doing what we did? Unfortunately, again, just like the weapons, when the Florian that was in charge of the Forge ship ended up dying, like 90% of what was on the ship just disappeared with the weapons. So when the Ciritan Empire captured that Florian Forge ship, it was basically down to the bare bones, you know? It was the command console, which they never understood how the hell it works, because the Florians have some weird technological mumbo-jumbo that allows them to control it. Ciritans never figured out how. There was the thrusters on the back of the ship, which they largely understood and kind of adapted to mega carriers, but not nearly as powerful or as efficient. And then there was, you know, the power generation system, which they had no fucking clue how the hell that worked. It didn't require fuel, it just produced power, and they don't know how, even after reverse engineering it, or ripping it apart multiple times, because they'd make detailed schematics as they were ripping it apart, and then put it back together and see if that gave them any insight, and it didn't, so they'd rip it apart again, look at all the things, and be like, how does this work? And then they put it back together again, and it still worked, even after having ripped it apart twice, and they were like, yeah, I have no clue how this works. Not even the faintest idea. And then the one that interests the Ciritan Empire the most was the Florians' FTL. Now, we had talked about this with the Ciritan Empire, that the Florians have a form of FTL. The Ciritans use skip-jump drive. The majority of all other major factions utilize interstellar highways, but the Florians are the only other species that has true FTL, and they can go pretty much wherever they want. And this idea was originally coined to me personally by the Necrons, known as inertialess drive. And basically what the Florian Forge ships do is they create a bubble. It's not quite a shield, but it's an energy bubble around the entire thing that is inside of the shields of the Forge ship. And whatever this does, it prevents the normal stress and strain that a ship would experience going at insanely fast speeds. And the Florian being entirely mechanical, much like the Necrons, they're capable of quite literally pushing the acceleration to the speed of light, and even driving and turning and curving around planets so that and other celestial bodies so that they don't slam into it at the speed of light. Because Florian technology is durable, but it's not hitting a planet at the speed of light durable. That will fuck it up and probably kill the planet. Like, actually crack the planet, you know? But so it allows them to go incredibly fast, and Florians also have a sort of suspension field throughout the entirety of their ship, which means that basically, again, much like that energy shield, the ship doesn't really feel the stress and strain of sudden movements or incredibly fast speeds, which means the Florians will literally be moving at the speed of light, and literally as fast as you can click your fingers, dead stop. Dead stop, like they hit a wall. And you would think that would fucking rip the ship apart. The Florian would go flying through the windshield and into the void of space. But it's like nothing happened. Like, there's not even like a particle of dust shoots forward. Like, nothing. It's completely calm on the inside. Like, you weren't just going at the speed of light and then just went to zero in less than a nanosecond, you know? And it's wild to see this because all of a sudden it's like you're looking up and out in the void of space directly in front of you, and you blink your eyes, and suddenly there's a Ford ship, and it's like, holy shit, it's there. So, yeah. As for actual Florian weaponry, again, the Silverton Empire largely doesn't understand it. It's largely almost seems like some sort of white energy. They're not entirely sure what it is. Like I said, they're messing around with time manipulation technology, but it's not really... not on personal use level yet. But they do have energy weapons, and they do have kinetic weapons as well, like ballistics weapons, that they will utilize at times, and it's... the Ciritans, honestly, they can't describe how it works, because they've only ever seen it when it's shooting at them. But it's a white energy with an ever so slight bluish tinge, kind of like their skin, or I guess not skin, but their outer carapace. And the second it comes into contact with anything, it just vaporizes it. Like, it doesn't matter how thick the armor is, it just vaporizes it. And as a result, this is a huge problem because not only are there essentially cannon variants that fire a giant fuck-off ball of this white energy, there's also far smaller, lower output, rapid fire, like a fucking minigun that just mulches through things, depending on the situation. It even, again, like, it doesn't need a sniper rifle variant, because they're pinpoint accurate at any range. So, you know, they have giant fuck-off cannon to deal with big obstacles, essentially the assault rifle / minigun mode to just mulch anything that's in front of you, and then they have like a shotgun version just to deal, you know, like, I can't be bothered to strafe, so I'm just gonna bring this out and bam, everything in a massive area is dead. And it's like, there you go. You know, I don't need to waste the energy on the giant like cannon, you know, that's a lot of energy, you know. And again, power production isn't largely understood. The Silverton Empire doesn't know if these weapons are being powered via a reactor inside of the Florian themselves, because the Florians do have a reactor inside of them. Again, they don't know how it works, largely because they blew the damn thing up when they killed the Florian. Like, there was very little of the Florian carcass left. Like, they eviscerated it. That is beautiful. Holy shit. But anyway, so, as a result, yeah. They don't largely understand. They don't know if they're being... because they're obviously energy weapons, which means they have to have some form of electricity, some sort of power but they don't know if it's coming from the reactor of the Florian or if it's coming from somewhere else and somehow being transmitted over a theoretically infinite distance with seemingly, it's like completely wireless, like radio waves kind of thing, and it's completely undetectable. The Siritan Empire, God bless them, they have tried everything to try and figure this out. They have sent out sensors and scanners and everything that you can imagine to try and get even just the tiniest minuscule of energy signature to try and figure out where it's coming from. They never pick up anything. It's just, at this point, they're not even sure if there's like maybe a reactor in the weapon itself, and maybe that's the thing, or they literally have no idea. So, one final thing with the Florians is this. For the most part, every single species has, in some way, shape, or form, a capability to use magic. We've covered the Bastilians of the Barramon, how they have to use special items in order to cast magic, but by and large, every single faction is capable of using magic, with the exception of the Florians. Even technically the Blight Plague, in a weird, twisted way, can use a somewhat familiar form of magic, But the Florians, the concept is a complete anathema to them. Like, it really is, they're very similar to the Necrons, Warp power isn't detectable or very well understood by Necrons. And it's the same thing with Florians and magic. It's not that they don't understand, it's not that they don't know that it exists. They definitely know it exists. They've been on the receiving side of it many a time. But they don't understand the mechanics behind it. And as a result, a lot of times, how I said before, the Florians would kind of just like fixate on a specific item. Largely, it's usually technological, but if it's anything like a magical artifact, they will relentlessly pursue it until they have it, just to see if they can't glean anything from it, because they cannot understand magic whatsoever. And it's strange that a civilization or species, which granted is entirely synthetic, but a species that is as advanced as the Florians are, they can't understand something that literally everyone else can use. So as a result, the Florians don't really have much of a counter to magic. I mean, the majority of spells won't be able to pierce their armor regardless. It's more of just like, when it comes to magic, it's usually weaker than the weapons that the Royal Army is using or whoever the Florians are fighting. And as a result, it's basically like throwing cotton balls at a person's skin and expecting the cotton ball to suddenly just rupture their body. It's not going to happen. Now, that being said, there have been situations where Florians have been critically damaged thanks to magic. In fact, all 3 Florian kills were actually done by our Calamities. Or at the very least, back before they were called the Calamities. So we'll get more on this when we actually cover the Calamities, but originally they were known as the Siritan Natural Disasters, and eventually they just were like, this is just kind of disrespectful at this point, we need to give them a new title, the Siritan Calamities. But so, the old school natural disasters, there was 10 of them. There was always 10. And it was usually the top 5. Those are the ones that matter. These are our heavyweights. 10 through 6 are usually, they're powerful, but they're not like, they're quantity over quality. Quantity over quality. They didn't have very high quality, so it was just like, if we can find some schmuck that can use magic, congratulations. You're now the 10th Siritan Natural Disaster. But again, it was usually the top 5, that those were the ones that mattered. And obviously, back then, this is before Rex showed up, which we'll get to him at some point. Duran was the first Siritan Natural Disaster, which at this point, I've talked about him so much without having done a deep dive, this shouldn't surprise you at all. There was also another individual that we've, I think, talked about once, who was the 4th Siritan Natural Disaster, known as Isaiah Tempera. And Duran has 2 Florian kills under his belt, which should surprise nobody, given how much I've hyped him up and how much I've said puts every anime protagonist to shame, you know. But Isaiah has essentially a one-trick pony ability. And the thing about Isaiah is he is known as the Winter General. And he utilizes a unique type of magic that is basically the polar opposite of Duran's. Duran uses molten magic. He can only use molten magic. He cannot use any other form of magic. Isaiah uses winter magic. He can only use winter magic. He cannot use any other type of magic. And as a result, the two, you would think that they'd really hate each other because there's literally opposites, fire and ice. You know, they don't mix very well, obviously. The two tolerate each other more than anybody else. Like, Duran isn't an individual to make friends with any of the natural disasters at the time or the calamities nowadays. But Isaiah was the one person that he kind of tolerated, you know? Like, it wasn't uncommon to see, because they're, like, identical when it comes to personality. You know, they're cold, they're kind of heartless, they're always just kind of brooding in the corner, you know, just kind of perpetually having, like, a pissed off face when they're not actually pissed off. So it wasn't too uncommon to see them, like, in the middle of a battlefield standing side by side, just brooding together and just, like, tolerating each other's presence. But Isaiah has an ability, his most powerful spell, known as Absolute Critical. And basically, it's a giant ice spear that appears in the atmosphere, like at the very highest point of the atmosphere, and then it just collides with the planet. Because it doesn't technically... We'll get more into it when we actually cover Isaiah, but it doesn't move. It just blinks into position, and whatever was there is bisected in an instant. And it's the only situation where somebody weaker than Duran has managed to do it, because the Florian was not expecting this. And basically just like... what the hell is it called from Gears of War? The Hammer of Dawn or something like that? The fucking orbital satellite that you just call down on things. It was basically that. Just bam! The Florian's dead. And everybody was like, holy shit! Don't piss off Isaiah. But yeah. So they don't really have a counter to magic. You know? When it comes to mages, I mean, nobody can really challenge a calamity and survive unless you are a calamity. But if we're talking about normal mages... You know, they have wards. They have magical shields, which nullify or outright negate the effects of magic, especially if it's magic that is slightly weaker or slightly stronger than their own, you know? But it's like, the Florians have nothing like that. Like, they have armor and carapaces that can survive the most brutal of technological weapons, but they have basically no counter other than just the natural durability of their bodies. So, yeah, I think we're going to call it there for the Florians. You know, I've covered everything that I kind of wanted to cover with them. Obviously, as with all of the deep dives for our primary factions, there's more information, but we'll cover it as it becomes relevant. You know, these deep dives on the main factions, this is to give you a fairly good idea of what the species is and how they operate. I don't know what we're going to do for the next episode. I know I say that like every single episode, but I honestly don't know. Like, we could do the Baramon, we could do the humans, we could do the Bastilians, we could do the Vetans, but they're not super relevant. Like, they are the other major factions, but they're not super relevant. Actually, did we do Bastilians? I don't think we did. I think we just touched on them shortly. But yeah. So I'll figure it out. In probably one of the 7 Days to Die episodes, I will say what we're gonna do next. But for right this second, I don't know what we're gonna do. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. of Shadow Legacies Deep Dive, and I hope you guys are looking forward to whatever the next one is, as well as our 7 Days to Die series and our Sunday this week, Sunday Night Live. And then it's the following week where we have our Saturday and Sunday Night Live, because our RimWorld series is over, in case you weren't informed yet. It is over. I rage quit on the damn thing. Sort of. I mean, it was really laggy, and it was just basically impossible to play, but sort of. But anyway, as I've said recently, there will be another RimWorld series coming out. I am just waiting on a lot of the mods that I enjoy to use to kind of get updated to 1.6 on RimWorld. So far, I've been playing it in my off time. So far, as much as I fucking hated Anomaly, I am loving Odyssey right now. I have not gotten that far into it so far. In fact, I have the Grav Core, and that's it. So, I really, really haven't gotten into it yet. But so far, I'm enjoying it, But, so yeah, I will see you guys in the next episode. See ya.